Hi!
Hi.
Welcome back. Anybody who's been in the gacha game space for any amount of time has heard of the term end of service. It refers to a gacha game's death, or when its development team decide it's time to stop making updates, shut down the servers, and walk away from their project. It's happened countless of times to many nameless titles nobody truly cares about, and to many large titles whose deaths a lot of people were genuinely bummed out about. It doesn't take much searching on YouTube to find those like sticks, documenting the countless deaths of gacha games happening all the time. But this raises a question. When do gacha games finally die? Is it being unremarkable for so long everyone forgets about you? Is it making such a terrible decision and doubling down everyone abandons you? Or is it something else entirely? Just before we jump into the content, I've got something I want to talk to you about. Creating these videos over the past 2 years has been super fun, but it's also a lot of work. So help me make more content for you by checking out Rage Shadow Legends. I'm sure you all know about it at this point. It's a fun fantasy-themed turn-based RPG game, all about collecting characters and fighting powerful enemies. It's got all the RPG game essentials, tons of amazing gameplay, and incredibly fleshed out endgame content. So, if you're a fan of this stuff, you're going to love it. You'll also get rewards valued at more than $200 by downloading it using my link in the description and the pinned comment. It's free, you won't regret it, and I would really appreciate it. Now let's get on to the content. Now, aside from the obvious, Arknights is going to last 50 billion years, the first thing we have to talk about before anything else is the single biggest reason why gacha games end service, and that is not making enough money. When a gacha game simply cannot fund its own development, the dev team can't get paid, servers can't be left online, and the CEO of the company can't profit. There are some very obvious examples of this. I mean, Black Beacon, for example, shut down its servers just a few months after release because the devs would have made more money collecting trash off the street rather than continuing to develop that game. However, this is not the only reason, and there are actually a few other reasons that lead to this that I want to talk about today. A lot of people have been discussing the end of Fate Grand Order recently. It's a super old game that has incredibly outdated graphics and UI design, and even animations and gacha mechanics. The game has even been releasing updates that are the equivalent of death flags in anime, like an insane number of rerun banners, being overly generous like never before, and the biggest flag of them all, the story of the game finally ending. This started to make people talk about either a complete FGO end of service or an FGO part 2. In my opinion, Type Moon definitely loves money way too much, and Fate Grand Order is still definitely a cow ready to be milked. Just look at the summer event this year. A part 2 is way more likely, and in the case of Fate Grand Order, a second part might be huge. Imagine FGO with a, finally, upgraded UI over the abysmal dog we've had to deal with over the years. Imagine it with upgraded sprites, properly voice-acted stories, and even better animations and character design. Imagine it with proper endgame content that is similar to Arknights and Battle Cats. It would genuinely be the next best thing, which would rival even its previous success. From the way I see it, FGO is currently a pretty niche game. Now, it's absolutely huge, don't get me wrong, however, compare it to modern gacha games, and you think it's a game that came out more than a decade ago because it obviously is, yet it is still making a huge amount of money every month. FGO Part 2 that revitalizes the game into something the newer generation of gacha players is more used to would make the game much bigger than it already is. However, there is still a non-zero chance, no matter how small it is, that Type Moon actually pulls the trigger and ends service for FGO. And if they do actually decide to end of service with the story, it would be one of the first, like another game we'll be talking about soon, to end of service after completing its story. However, again, a part 2 is way more likely in my opinion. A notorious case of this that came after a completed story is Honkai Impact 3rd. They announced and released part 2 after Kiana's story was basically finished. They revamped the game's visuals, a little bit of the combat, though it was kept mostly similar, some of the UI, and a couple other things. The beginning for this part 2 is one of the most negatively received gacha updates I've ever seen. It was supposed to be a mainstream introduction for HI3 that puts it on the same level of its younger sister Genshin, but it turned out to have a pretty underbaked story according to basically all HI3 fans. Everything they did in all of the start of part 2 is nothing compared to things like the Elysian Realm. However, truth be told, there is nothing but praise getting thrown at the recent stuff they've been doing, which is honestly great to hear. I will hopefully try it out soon, but currently my focus is on Enfield. Now, Honkai Impact 3rd made so little money for Hoyoverse during most of part 2 that even this giant started getting EOS flags, the biggest of which is the decreased update frequency, which is a pretty terrible cycle for gacha games that creates a pretty bad positive feedback loop. In a large company like Hoyoverse, making less money means getting less resources, which means longer patch cycles, which means having less content for your player base, specifically less new characters, which means making less money. If you're a Honkai Impact 3rd dev, as much as it's obvious this game is Hoyo's passion project, you are afraid of end of service because of this cycle. Let me explain. The game I mentioned earlier, Dragalia Lost, is a gacha game that ended service back in 2022 after its main story ended. Mind you, this is totally a route that both Fate Grand Order and Honkai Impact 3rd could take or could have taken. While we don't have much information, I doubt that the game wasn't making enough money to fund its own development. I believe, convinced by these Reddit users, that Nintendo just didn't want to fund the game anymore. With how popular the game was, it totally didn't shut down because of not making enough money. The story finishing was a huge factor alongside company politics. Anyway, back to the patch cycle flag. If we go into the Dragalia Lost wiki, we can see that updates were way more frequent at first, and then they slowed way down when the game was on its last breaths. Patch cycle slowing down is a clear sign of impending EOS. However, I also don't think HI3 is ending service anytime soon. So, not making enough money, the end of the main story, and company politics are always gacha games could EOS. The end of the main story is pretty self-explanatory. You either make a part 2 or EOS. Company politics is a complicated topic, but it's not something we could really read into because we don't know how companies think. Well, then what about not making enough money? When do gacha games stop making money? The most common scenario is when a game just loses popularity over time, pushing out weak updates, not pushing out enough updates, or not making anything revolutionary and just slowly fading away. Or it could be when the devs suddenly make an incredibly unpopular decision that the entire player base decides to just quit the game. Do you remember Black Beacon? According to Sensor Tower, this game made $48,750 during the last month before their EOS announcement. This is obviously a pathetic amount of money that is completely unsustainable for any proper gacha game, so why did such an anticipated game that reported nearly $1 million twice just a couple months before drop off so suddenly? When the game launched, it had one of the worst gacha launches of the year, probably the single worst. The biggest issues were game balance, optimization, and performance, and not releasing with a dedicated PC client, and having to rely on a very low amount of account slots with the Google Play Games PC beta, which screwed over the entire PC player base for the entirety of the first 1 or 2 weeks of the game's launch. Apology rewards for this abysmal launch were disappointing, but most players were going to turn a blind eye because the game seemed like genuinely good fun, but then they decided to completely cuck the entire global player base when they launched in Chinese servers and started playing favorites by giving the CM player base a much better apology reward package. They refused to apologize for a while, and then when they finally did, it was way too little, way too late. The global player base was already over the game and nobody wanted to really play it, and the Chinese player base just didn't seem interested enough in the game, resulting in an insane downfall and eventually end of service. However, unpopular decisions that leave the player base angry are incredibly commonplace in the gacha market, specifically in 2 of the most popular gacha games of all time, Honkai Star Rail and Genshin Impact. There are so many terrible decisions made by Hoyoverse that it would take a multiple-hour video to talk about all of them. The Castaways Global Pass and Honkai Star Rail, as well as Genshin's 3 pull situation and terrible first anniversary are just a few examples. The reason why these games never saw anything like Black Beacon's downfall is simply because they are way too big to actually fail like this. I do not see these games ever falling due to disappointing players or due to slowly dying and fading away, because they are such high quality games that any player that quits will almost instantly get replaced by 1 or even 2 more players after them that are pulled in by how great these games look. These games are designed to treat new players like kings and queens and non-binary monarchs, because new players are way more profitable than old players. They don't see issues because they are overwhelmed by how great the game looks and how much content they have and that really hot character that they like. So, when does a gacha game like this die? When would a giant such as Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail that is so high in quality, it always pulls in new players and brings more money, finally announce end of service? There is and will be no such thing as an immortal gacha or live service game, because even games that lasted 10 years died, and every gacha game will eventually die as well. Maybe these 2 games will EOS when their story concludes, or maybe they'll pull an HI3 and announce a part 2, trying to milk as much money as possible from their player base. They are just way too big to die a traditional gacha game death. If I were to throw a guess into the air, I totally see Genshin Impact lasting well into 2030, and Honkai Star Rail possibly even hitting 2040 before EOSing. I don't even see these games dying due to heavy competition, because while I do believe that Wuwa is a game 10 times better than Genshin, that is still a debate among communities, and barely any longtime Genshin players actually thinks that Wuwa is better. Same thing goes for Honkai Star Rail. Oh, and by the way, I totally see Zenless Zone Zero EOSing before both HSR and Genshin because it's just not as properly popular as either of them. Now, I want to be clear, I don't want any of these games to end of service. I want all of them to have more and more great updates, and as much as I hate Hoyoverse for ruining HSR and Genshin, I do want to see both of these games improve because I'm still pretty connected to a lot of the characters in both of these games. I want Fate Grand Order to create a part 2 and become a more massive game than it already is, and I want Honkai Impact 3rd to live as long as possible because of the incredible stories it has given us over the years. And obviously, I want Arknights and Battlecats to actually be immortal. So that's everything I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this in the future, and join the Express Rain Discord server for a fun and lovely community to hang out with. Make sure to check out Raid using my link in the description to get $200 worth of free goodies. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time.